So I want to talk to you about Bellwether, which is an interesting project in a way because it's almost like a retrospective of McQueen's work, but it happens kind of relatively early on in his career, and it's when he won a CFDA award, 2003, but it also kind of tallies when he got his CBE over here. So it's an interesting time. I think it's an interesting time to talk about for him because it was when he was starting to kind of really get noticed and get acclaim. We've spoken before about how he didn't always have such favourable reviews. Tell me a bit from your perspective what was commissioned and what you were tasked with doing.
So it was a film to show at the CFDA, and they wanted, Lee and I wanted to show his, I think what one forgets is that he drew beautifully as well.
Yeah.
His drawings were incredible. I have actually lots of them as it goes. And I think it was the idea that of showing a way of actually what he drew becoming real life. Yeah. It's quite a sort of Walt Disney type idea actually. It's a sort of the illustration becomes real.
Yeah.
And so that was the basis of it. And so to achieve that, we put had a glass table which he leant on and drew on a piece of paper, and we shone a projection of his video of whatever show that he was illustrating onto that piece of paper. And we just put it in reverse. So it appears that he draws and it comes to life, whereas in fact in real life we filmed it the other way around. So you stop the frame of the dress and he sort of fills it in. So it's just a sort of sleight of hand. But it was an idea, Lee was always fascinated with things like Walt Disney and things from childhood.
Yeah.
And so that sort of rather gentle and poetic idea of the drawing becoming real life was the basis of this.
It's really interesting to talk about designers' practices as well, because there's so much focus on his kind of cutting and draping, and it's interesting just to hear you talk about him drawing, because I think that's something that perhaps when you think about McQueen as a designer, people focus so much on that sense of him being very visceral and working with the body, and a lot of designers don't draw at all. It's interesting that he did.
Yeah. Would
you say that was how he started the design process?
I don't know that process well enough, I'm afraid, to be answered that with certainty. My guess is yes. And I saw a lot of sketches, and when we go to meetings, there was often sketches being done that he would sketch on a bit of paper to try and express what he wanted.
Yeah.
And his sketches are about as explanatory as mine at that stage, sort of more sort of wobbly lines, and we sort of read into it. But when it came to fashion illustration, he just had a gift for it.
Yeah.
And very beautiful. Like John Galliano, an incredible draftsman.
Yeah.
And I think it's true that not all designers do have that skill or that gift or express themselves in that way.
Yeah.
It's part of a really early seed in my mind of the greatness of fashion illustration. That's why at Show Studio now we sell it and we promote it and we champion it, because it is a real, incredibly beautiful art.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the designers that do draw, you never see their drawings or hardly ever see their drawings.
No, you don't. Yeah. And it's interesting, a lot of the big designers today that don't draw, like someone like Raf Simons never sketches, and a lot
Gareth doesn't either.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I find that very interesting. I don't think it's something that perhaps people are aware of, how diverse your practice can be as a designer. Let's talk more though about this idea of when he did start to get, for want of a better word, kind of famous or acclaimed. Yeah. Do you remember that happening? Or did it always feel a little bit to you like he was always a bit of an outsider?
No, I don't. There was no particular point where you thought, he's become something huge. I mean, obviously when he signed the Gucci contract was for so many millions of pounds, we were a bit like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of millions. But there was never a sort of an attitude, I didn't ever feel that. There's a certain amount of the way he treated his own body, which was reflected a little bit of his more public persona.
Yeah.
Because he lost a lot of weight. There was a certain sort of, there was a conscious change. So I think it's sort of interesting. I was wanting to do a project on how male designers treat their bodies.
Yeah, Marc Jacobs is very interesting.
Marc Jacobs is, Karl Lagerfeld is.
Yeah.
There's a lot that that change physically how they are. Whether that's a sort of because they spend so much time working with very slender, very beautiful women.
Mr. Pearl.
Yes, well, there are many examples of how that. And is it emulating those women? Is it desire to, or is it just because it's possible because you have money now and you have good cosmetic surgeons? So that's a possibility for you. So there was that I noticed. I noticed Lee's body shape changing, and because when he first worked with him, he was quite a little sort of round. He's quite rotund.
Really stocky. Yeah.
And he became quite svelte. And the teeth seemed to change colour, and it all seemed to get a little bit more glamorous in that way.
Yeah.
This isn't something that is good or bad. It's just a change, and that reflects a sort of an acknowledgement that he has to have a public persona.
Yeah.
But I think before he just didn't care.
Yeah.
He he didn't care whether he had a public persona or not. So I think there's changes in there. His attitude never changed. I didn't ever feel that he was different with me or with anybody who worked with me.
Yeah.
There was never, became somebody he wasn't before. He was always the same in that way. But I guess, with increasing stress levels on him, perhaps made his behaviour a little bit more, ups and downs a little bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But yeah, he was always fairly moody.
And let's talk about, it's not something that I've asked you about before, and it's interesting because, as I mentioned at the start, the Bellwether film, it did time quite nicely with him getting the CBE, which is a massive recognition.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in his idea of kind of Britishness, particularly because his work is so, I think, particularly because of Savage Beauty, it's seen as so kind of British and Scottish and English in interesting ways, and he's come to really sort of define what it means to be a kind of British designer. And do you feel that when you were working with him, that he has an interesting sense of national identity? Because that's something I think your work has toyed with, national identity, particularly the skinhead stuff and that
certainly
kind of
thing. The skinhead did. I think you do it from the inside. You don't do it sort of objectively from the outside. So I didn't ever feel that was one of his sort of things. That it wasn't an obsession. It wasn't a sort of cause for him to sort of try to either critique or to. But I think he critiqued, and I think he would get upset about injustice. Yeah. And of course, any national sovereignty or national identity has probably caused quite a lot of injustice to get to the point of an empire like the British Empire. That caused a lot of injustice and a lot of unfairness to a whole range of people, from Scottish people to Indian people, to a whole range of different. So there's a lot of injustice for him to find there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I think he associated his own feelings of probably came from his family and from his real life, almost real, but in his personal life. I think he extrapolated that feeling of unfairness, to things like the way Scotland has been treated. And
it's interesting, isn't it, how he's come to define London fashion. When you see any kind of think piece now where the 4 cities are analysed, that notion of London of being kind of creative and slightly dark, and it does come from that period, where he and other designers, people like Hussein Chalayan, were showing, and that's really interesting. And I think it ties into, again, what you do, where people often make a lot of, like, you being a British photographer, and I think this idea of London creativity, those years where you were working with him, have really come to define what London means to people. Yeah. Do you feel that ever?
It's again, it's doing it from inside. You don't feel that. I don't like, as I'm sure I've told you before, I don't like nationalism as a concept. Yeah. I think it's very largely should be got rid of. I'm not somebody who gets very sort of overcome with pride about being British. I grew up in France, and I grew up in Belgium. A lot of my formative years, which is the end of my, from sort of 6 to 11, I was abroad. And I felt a lot more sort of emotional attachment to that in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And when I came back to Britain, it was actually quite a shock of the culture and how, in the early 70s, how rigid our culture was at that point, and how much we were still a very little island mentality and of foreigners, and there was, and it wasn't this acceptance, or didn't seem to be much this acceptance of ideas from Europe. I mean, there's lots of sort of the early 70s were quite, almost like the 1950s. They were quite strict in their sort of cultural boundaries. And so I didn't feel a natural kinship with Britain. And I've never been a great sort of flag waving sort of. I don't like that. I don't like nationalism. I think it's a difficult and slightly unpleasant, and slightly relevant to me. Yeah. And now, of course, with the internet, where I talk to people across the globe all the time,
it doesn't
there's no sort of physical boundaries.
But it is interesting, isn't it, about how people analyse McQueen's work, because they often talk about this, Scottish pride or British pride, and it's interesting to hear you talk about it, and more he was interested in the difficulties and the complexities, and that's what drove him, less than this kind of abstract, obsession with his roots. That's quite interesting. I think perhaps hasn't been. I
really don't think he had a sort of British pride or Scottish pride. He had pride for people, or I think he felt that he was showing the suffering of people, certainly within the sort of the Scottish part of his persona, and I think, but there is a certain. I guess there's, as a society, British society or English society, whatever you want to call it, there's a certain amount of fair play, of tolerance, of intellectualism, of trying to understand different opinions, of freedom of speech, and all of those things he would have been completely in agreement with. Yeah. So I think there is, if we weren't to talk about some sort of pride of the society we live in rather than nationalistic boundaries, I think our championing of free speech or our championing of freedom of thought, happily mixing together different cultures and religions and everything else, I think is really important, and I'd be absolutely proud of that. So I think he would probably feel the same.
And just to go back to Bellwether a little bit, do you remember how you were selecting, like, the looks or the bits of footage you wanted to include? How involved was he in the making of the?
Oh, he's very involved in it.
Yeah.
He's very much directed by him in terms of what he wanted to show, what he wanted to draw.
Yeah.
And we spent. I remember the session was at his place in, I think, Amwell Street. It was a long session, probably there from sort of 4 in the afternoon until sort of got midnight, where he was painting and repainting and trying things. The film's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, actually seeing him draw is quite incredible. And seeing the sort of concentration, because the camera sometimes is below the table, so you look up from, you have the paper's eye view of Lee McQueen drawing. And I think that's quite special and unique.
Well, it's interesting because I was going to say this, and it was just something I thought of this morning actually, which is one thing I find really interesting about all your work with him is you put him in it a lot more than your collaborative relationships with a lot of other people. Like, I know there are images when you worked for a long time with John Galliano of John in them, like that beautiful one with Alec Work, but with McQueen, it feels like, almost every project in some way, it's an exaggeration, but a lot of them, he's in them physically. And do you know why? Was that conscious? Or
it was conscious because he liked the idea of being, and often the conversations would be, he didn't actually like me photographing his clothes in that way. Yeah. So normally an idea would come out of some sort of desire to work together, and would more often involve him than it would do his clothes. I think, like Yoji Yamamoto was a little bit in the same way, that when I used to work for Yoji, he'd say to me, "Show me my dreams." And he didn't want to see me his clothes again. He'd already done his clothes, created his clothes, thought his clothes. He wanted the clothes to be a stepping stone, or a springboard in fact, to something else, another vision. And I think it's a little similar with Lee. I don't think he wanted to revisit his clothes again. He'd already done that. So in part of, I think he liked being photographed.
It was not vanity so much, because he didn't mind being photographed in quite an uncomfortable way.
No, in fact, the more uncomfortable, the better.
Yeah.
Often we'd string him up by chains and cover him in stuff, and have a head exploding or whatever it was. So no, they weren't vanity projects. Obviously, he wanted to look a particular way, but they weren't just vanity projects. It wasn't just making me look great. Yeah. He used his body and his own physical persona to express a lot of the feelings that were current. I mean, the obvious one is the head exploding.
And the feelings in his clothes, as well as the feelings in his mind.
Yes, but I think they're probably the same thing.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks, Nick.
Pleasure.